The sky above Clearwater County, Montana, had been perfectly quiet for most of that Tuesday night. The stars were out. The air smelled like pine and dry grass. Old Farmer Dale Hutchkins had been sitting on his porch the way he always did when he could not sleep, drinking coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, watching nothing in particular. Then the sky cracked open. It started as a light, a single orange dot moving too fast and too wrong to be any plane Dale had ever seen. It left a burning trail behind it, like someone had dragged a hot iron across a black cloth. The sound came next, a deep tearing roar that shook the boards under Dale's boots and rattled the windows of his house. His dog, a tired old hound named Biscuit, shot off the porch and ran under the truck. Dale stood up. The object hit somewhere past the north ridge. The ground shook once hard like a punch from underneath the earth. A column of fire and smoke rose into the dark sky, glowing orange and red against the stars. Dale stared at it for a long moment. Then he went inside, picked up his phone, and called 911. By the time Captain Sarah Park arrived, there were already two Montana state troopers blocking the dirt road that led toward the ridge, a fire truck idling uselessly on the shoulder, and 3 black government subs parked at odd angles in the field. Sarah stepped out of her vehicle and showed her credentials to the trooper at the rope line. He looked at her ID badge, looked at her face, and stepped aside without a word. Sarah had been stationed at Malmstrom Air Force Base for 2 years. She had handled unusual things before, or at least she thought she had. But as she crested the ridge and looked down into the shallow valley below, she felt something shift in her chest. The thing in the valley was not a plane. It was large, maybe 140 feet from one end to the other, and it had buried its nose deep into the earth on impact. The shape of it was unlike anything in any manual she had ever studied. It was smooth in places and broken in others, with pieces of the outer hull peeled back like a crushed tin can. Strange symbols were etched along the sides, faintly glowing in a pale blue color that did not match the firelight. The material looked like metal, but moved slightly when the smoke drifted over it, almost like it was still alive in some way. No fire crew was going near it. The men and women who had arrived first were standing in a wide half-circle at a safe distance, talking into radios, pointing, some with weapons drawn and aimed at nothing in particular. Sarah walked down the slope toward the crash site. She pulled on her gloves and kept her hand near but not on her sidearm. Behind her, she heard someone call her name, telling her to wait for the containment team. She kept walking. She got within 40 feet of the wreck when she heard the sound. It was not a mechanical sound. It was not the groan of cooling metal or the hiss of leaking gas, though there were plenty of those. This sound was different. Low, soft, unmistakably alive, like breathing. Like many people breathing very carefully and very quietly, trying not to be noticed. Sarah stopped walking. She looked at the torn section of hull to her left, where a dark gap had opened up between 2 crumpled panels. The gap was just wide enough for a person to fit through. She took 1 step toward it. Something moved in the shadow. Sarah's hand moved to her weapon, but she did not draw it. She stood very still. The air was cold and smelled like burned metal and something else, something faintly sweet, like flowers she could not name. A hand appeared at the edge of the gap. It was not a human hand. It was longer than a human hand, with 4 fingers instead of 5. The skin a deep smooth blue, the color of a winter sky just before dark. The fingers curled around the edge of the broken hull, and then slowly, carefully, a face appeared. Sarah did not move. The face was humanoid in its general shape, but the eyes were very large, nearly twice the size of human eyes, and the irises were silver, catching the fire light and throwing it back in small broken sparks. The skin was the same blue as the hand. The being was looking at her with an expression Sarah could not immediately name, but she recognized the feeling behind it. She had seen that expression on the faces of people pulled from collapsed buildings, on children found alone in disaster zones. Pure terror. More sounds came from inside the wreck. A low murmur of voices, the same language repeated, urgent and afraid. The figure in the gap turned back toward the sounds and said something quickly. A string of syllables that carried no meaning Sarah could process, but carried every feeling she needed to understand. It was telling the others to be quiet. It was telling them to stay calm. Sarah lowered herself slowly to one knee, putting herself at a level below the figure rather than above it. She kept her hands visible and away from her weapon. She did not speak. She simply waited. The figure looked back at her. It studied her face for a long time. Its breathing was shallow and rapid. A deep cut ran along one side of its head and dark blood nearly black in the firelight had dried along its jaw and neck. It was hurt. They were all hurt. Sarah pointed to herself. "Sarah," she said quietly. The figure stared. "Sarah," she said again slower and touched her chest. The figure watched her hand move then very slowly with the caution of someone diffusing something they were not sure about. It touched its own chest. "Sarah," it said. The voice was soft and rough at the same time, damaged by smoke or fear or both. Sarah nodded once behind her boots on gravel. One of the troopers had followed her down. "Captain Park, you need to step back from that." "Stay where you are," Sarah said without turning around. Her voice was flat and carrying, the kind of voice that did not ask twice. The boot stopped. She looked back at Zia. Zia was watching the trooper with those wide silver eyes. The terror had spiked again, and the figure had pulled back slightly into the shadow. Sarah raised one hand, palm out, asking for a moment. She turned just enough to look at the trooper over her shoulder. "Back up," she said. "All the way to the ridge. Tell the others not to approach. Nothing gets fired. Nobody moves without my word." The trooper opened his mouth. "I outrank you," Sarah said simply. "Move." The boots retreated. Sarah turned back to the wreck. Zia had not run. Zia was still there watching Sarah with those silver eyes trying to calculate something. Trust maybe the odds of it. Whether it was worth the risk. Then a smaller figure appeared beside Zia. This one was shorter, much shorter, clearly young. A child, the same blue skin, the same silver eyes, but rounder in the face and less guarded in the expression. The child looked at Sarah with open curiosity rather than fear. The way children sometimes look at the world before the world has had enough. Time to teach them to be afraid. The child looked at Sarah. Then the child reached out one small blue hand. Sarah felt something move in her throat. She reached out and took the child's hand carefully. The way you take the hand of something precious and breakable. The child's fingers were warm and wrapped around two of Sarah's fingers. It squeezed once. Zia made a sound, not a word exactly. Something between a word and a sharp exhale. Like someone had pressed a wound and the pain had escaped through the mouth. Sarah looked up at Zia. "I'm not going to let anyone hurt them," she said. She knew Zia could not understand the words. She said them anyway. "Any of them, I promise." She pulled out her radio. She held it up so Zia could see it, then spoke into it calmly. "This is Captain Park at the crash site. I need medical teams, non-armed, forward to my position immediately. I also need every weapon pointed away from this wreck right now. Not lowered away. We have survivors. Civilian status. They are injured and scared. Treat them accordingly. If anyone fires a weapon without my direct order, I will have them court-martialed before the sun comes up. Arc out." There was a long silence on the radio. Then someone said, "Copy that, Captain." The child Hale had not let go of Sarah's fingers. Zia stepped forward slowly out of the shadow and into the light. Standing fully upright, she was taller than Sarah by a head, slender and long-limbed, with a kind of quiet grace that the damage and the fear and the blood on her face could not completely take away. She said something, a full sentence this time, deliberate, looking directly into Sarah's eyes. Sarah shook her head gently to show she did not understand. Zia pointed upward at the sky. Then she made a shape with her hands, a curved motion Sarah could not decipher. Then she pointed to the wreck and to herself and to Sarah and then back to the sky. Sarah looked up at the sky. Then she looked back at Zia. Whatever they had run from was up there. Whatever had broken this ship and put blood on Za's face and turned 47 people into refugees in the dirt of a Montana valley was still out there somewhere in the dark between the stars. Sarah looked at Zara steadily. "Okay," she said. She did not know what was coming. She had no idea how large the thing coming was, how many ships, how much firepower, how complete the danger. She had none of that information yet. But the child was holding her hand, and the woman in front of her was bleeding and standing her ground. And whatever came next, Sarah Park had already made her decision. She stood up. She kept her hand in KLS, and she waited for the medical teams to come over the ridge. Behind her, the rest of the world was waking up. Satellites were repositioning. Generals were being called out of sleep. Government officials were being driven at high speed to secure rooms in buildings with thick walls and bad lighting. Screens were lighting up in a dozen countries. Voices were rising. None of that mattered yet. Right now, what mattered was this. A child from somewhere in the stars had reached out a hand in the dark, and a human had taken it. Everything that followed would grow from that moment, from that single small act of reaching across the unknown and finding that someone was reaching back. Sarah Park stood in the smoke and the firelight, holding KL's hand, looking up at the sky and thinking about what Za had pointed at. The stars looked back. They were very quiet, but they would not stay quiet for long. The facility they used was not built for anything like this. It had been a decommissioned research base in the hills outside of Billings, converted in a hurry over the course of 36 hours into something between a hospital and a diplomatic reception center with heavy military presence at the outer perimeter that the people running the conversion kept insisting was just a precaution. Sarah thought that was a strange word to use when you had 4 Apache helicopters circling the ridge and enough armed soldiers on the ground to hold off a small army. But the inside at least was quiet. The Lorathi had been brought in carefully on stretchers and on foot with the medical teams working fast and professionally. There had been one bad moment at the door when 2 soldiers had moved too quickly and a group of the refugees had panicked and backing against the wall. Voices ranging, someone in the back making a sound like a wounded animal. Sarah had stepped between the soldiers and the refugees and stood there with her arms out to each side like a gate until everyone calmed down. After that, the soldiers gave more space. There were 47 of them in total. 23 adults, 11 teenagers or young people, and 13 children. Had serious injuries that the human medical teams were struggling to treat because the Lathi biology was close to human in some ways and completely alien in others. And the doctors kept running into walls where what should work did not work, and what seemed impossible worked fine. One of the older Lathi, a quiet male with a long scar across his collarbone, turned out to have enough knowledge of medicine for both species to act as a bridge. He and the lead surgeon communicated through gestures and drawings for most of the first day, producing results neither could have managed alone. Hale stayed close to Sarah. The boy followed her at a slight distance, never quite touching, but always within arm's reach. When Sarah sat down, Cale sat nearby. When she moved to another room, he appeared in the doorway. 2 minutes later, Zaris noticed and watched this arrangement with an expression that Sarah was beginning to learn was the Lyrathi version of cautious acceptance. Tukta. James Osi arrived on the second day. He came in from Hydro on a military transport, carrying 3 bags and a bruise under one eye from walking into a door frame at the airport because he had been reading on his phone instead of watching where he was going. He was tall and broad-shouldered with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a habit of talking very fast when he was excited about something. He had spent 15 years studying theoretical xenologitists, which had always been considered a somewhat eccentric field for an academic to spend his life in, and he was now possibly the most important person on the planet. He shook Sarah's hand at the entrance and said, "Tell me everything." Before she had even spoken his name, she told him everything. He listened with his eyes moving fast, the way some people's eyes move when they are sorting and filing information in real time. By the time she finished, he had already pulled out a battered notebook and was writing things in a shorthand she could not read a translation device. He said, "Can I see it?" The Lorothy had brought very little off the ship before it became too dangerous to go back inside. A few personal items, some medical supplies they had grabbed in the chaos, and one device that looked like a flat oval stone about the size of a large hand, smooth and dark gray, with small raised symbols along one edge. Zia had been holding on to it. She had not offered it to anyone. James was taken to meet Zia. Sarah watched from a careful distance as he approached. He moved slowly, and he had left his notebook in his bag. He sat down on the floor several feet away from Zia, crossing his legs, making himself smaller. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out a small piece of wrapped candy, the kind he always carried. He looked at it, then set it on the floor between them and slid it slightly toward her. Not demanding, just offering. Zia looked at the candy. She looked at James. Then she reached out and picked it up. James smiled. He pointed at himself. James. It took 4 days. 4 days of careful, patient work. James sitting with the translation device for hours at a time, building a bridge word by word, sound by sound. The device was extraordinary. It seemed to learn actively, adjusting and updating its model of the new language every few hours, making connections, flagging patterns. James said it was the most sophisticated linguistic tool he had ever touched, and that whoever had built it understood language in ways that human science had not caught up with yet. On the 5th day, he and Zia had their first real conversation. Sarah was in the room. She watched Zia's face as she began to talk, really talk, for the first time since the crash. Watched the tension in the tall blue figure shift and change as the words came out and were understood. As the weight of holding the whole story inside with no way to share it finally began to lift, Zia spoke for a long time. James listened and translated and listened more. The Lirathi came from a world called Lith. It was a planet in a system 400 light-years from Earth, orbiting a star that humans had catalogued, but never named anything important. Lirith had been a quiet world, not a military power, not wealthy in the way that attracted aggressive neighbors. The Lathi were scientists and teachers and builders, a species that had spent centuries developing a deep understanding of the universe and a deep preference for peace. The Vorki had come 12 years ago. The first contact had seemed like a diplomatic encounter. 3 Vorki ships had entered the Lirith system and requested a meeting, and the Lirathi Council had agreed because that was the kind of people the Lathi were. They met. They talked. The Vorki had very specific demands, resources and territory, and a certain number of Lathi to serve on Vorki ships as technical workers. The Lathi said no. The Vorki came back with 1,000 ships. Zia paused here. Her large silver eyes moved to the window and stayed there for a moment. James did not rush her. Sarah did not move. Zia said that Lith burned for 3 days. She said it very simply. The way people sometimes say the worst things in the simplest words, because the simple words are the only ones that do not break apart when you try to use them. The survivors, a small number who had been away from the planet on a research vessel, had run. They had been running for years, moving between uninhabited systems, never staying anywhere long enough to be tracked. They had been heading toward a sanctuary world, a place they had heard existed at the far edge of a neutral region, when their navigation system failed catastrophically and their engines, damaged beyond repair, sent them tumbling through several uncharted jump points. They had not chosen Earth. They had not known Earth existed. They had simply fallen out of the sky in the only direction gravity would take them, and they had been lucky enough to hit a planet with an atmosphere and soft enough ground. Zia looked at Sarah when James finished translating this last part. She said something directly. James translated. She says she is sorry for bringing this trouble to your world. She says she knows what the Vorai do to anyone who stands between them and what they want. She says you should send them away before the Vorai find the crash signal. Sarah looked at Zia. She said, "Tell her we're not sending them away." James translated. Zia stared at Sarah for a long time. Then she said something else. She wants to know why. James said. Sarah thought about it. Because Hale held my hand, she said. And because it's the right thing to do, tell her that. James translated. Sarah looked down at her own hands for a moment. Then she nodded very slowly, a gesture they had learned the Lorathi used the same way humans did. The political storm was already building. Sarah sat through 2 video conferences that day with people in suits and uniforms who used phrases like calculated risk assessment and diplomatic liability and strategic exposure. Someone at the 3rd conference, a man from a think tank whose name Sarah had already forgotten, said clearly that the most sensible course of action was to move the refugees to a neutral orbital platform and negotiate their status with whoever came looking for them. He called it a measured approach. Sarah called it throwing people away. She said that in the conference, precisely and clearly looking directly into the camera, there was a silence. Someone else on the call cleared their throat. The next morning, President Amaradayo held a closed session with the United Earth Council. Sarah was not in that room. She sat outside in a corridor with James and Cale, who was eating a piece of plain bread and watching the humans walk back and forth with the focused attention of someone learning a new species. Sarah drank bad coffee. James read. The corridor was too bright and smelled like floor cleaner. After 2 hours and 11 minutes, the door opened. President Dio walked out. She was a small woman with a large presence. The kind of person whose stillness made the air around her feel organized. She looked at Sarah, then she looked at Kel. The council has voted, she said. The Lorathi are under Earth's protection. Full diplomatic status, non-negotiable. Sarah let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Kel looked up at her face, reading the change in her expression, and made a small sound that James later said was the Lorathi equivalent of a question mark. Sarah smiled down at him. It's good news, she said. We're staying. That was the evening of the 6th day. On the morning of the 7th day, the long-range scanner array on the dark side of the moon picked up a gravitational distortion signature at the outer edge of the solar system. The kind of signature a ship makes when it drops out of a long jump. Then 3 more. The officer on duty in the scanning station looked at the readings for a long time. He ran the check twice. Then he picked up his emergency channel and called it in. 3 ships moving inward on a direct heading for Earth. They were not running. They were not hiding. They were coming slowly and deliberately. The way something comes when it wants to be seen and wants whatever is watching to understand exactly what it is. The 7th day ended very quietly. But the 8th day was going to be very loud. The message arrived at exactly 4 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time. It came on every frequency at once. Radio, microwave, quantum band communications that humans barely knew existed. It pushed itself through satellite networks and deep space arrays and even through the old-fashioned radio telescopes that universities kept running on small budgets for nostalgic reasons. It played on every channel simultaneously. Every language Earth had ever broadcast into space and some languages that Earth had never used. As if whoever sent it had done their research, the message was simple. It said, "You are harboring property of the Vorki Empire. You will surrender the Lorathi to our ships within 72 hours. Failure to comply will result in the total elimination of your planet's capacity to resist. We do not negotiate with primitive civilizations. We do not grant extensions. You have 72 hours. That was it. No name, no greeting, no offer of any alternative, just the flat, clean statement of it, delivered with the complete confidence of something that had said the same words many times before and had never once been told no. Sarah heard the message played back at the emergency briefing 2 hours later. She sat in a room full of generals and admirals and government officials and watched their faces while they listened. Some of them went pale. Some of them went very still in the way that people go still when they are afraid but do not want to show it. One man near the back of the room, a senior defense analyst, pressed both hands flat on the table in front of him as if he needed something solid to hold on to. When it finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then, everyone started talking at once. The United Earth Council convened its emergency session 4 hours after the message arrived. It was the largest joint meeting of planetary leadership in human history conducted by secure video link because there was no time to put everyone in the same physical room. Heads of state and defense ministers and military commanders from every nation on Earth were on the screens, and the noise of it, even filtered through protocol and translation software, was enormous. Admiral Chan Wei stood at the front of the main briefing room in Geneva and waited for the noise to settle. He was a compact man in his late 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had spent decades learning to give nothing away. He had commanded Earth's combined space defense fleet for 6 years. He had been preparing for something like this for most of his career in the abstract way that military commanders prepare for things they hope will never become specific. He waited until the room was quiet, then he spoke. He said that as of this moment, Earth had 3 functional space-capable warships in operational condition, 2 more in various states of repair at the orbital dockyard, 4 deep space defense platforms on the lunar surface, 12 orbital weapons platforms, and a significant network of satellite-based weapons systems that had originally been designed for planetary defense against asteroid threats, but could be repurposed in theory. He said in theory because no one had actually tested them against anything that shot back. He showed the council the long-range scans of the 3 Vorki ships. Each one was larger than any human vessel by a factor of roughly 8. The energy signatures coming off their doctor systems were enormous. The weapons profiles that the scanning arrays had managed to capture in the brief window before the ships began using some kind of interference fields were, he said without exaggerating, significantly beyond current human countermeasures. Someone on one of the screens asked directly, "Can we beat them?" Chanwei said he did not believe 3 Vorki ships would be everything they sent. He said that based on what the Leroy had shared about Vorai military doctrine, the initial ships were almost certainly a demanding force, sent to deliver the ultimatum and confirm the target. If Earth refused, the follow-up would be much larger. The someone asked again, "Can we beat them?" Cheney said, "Not with what we have right now." "No." The noise came back louder this time. Sarah sat through it. She watched the screens. She watched the faces of people calculating, balancing, running the mathematics of survival against the mathematics of conscience. She had done some of that math herself in the past 48 hours, and she knew what the numbers looked like. She also knew that numbers did not tell the whole story because numbers did not account for what it meant to look a child in the eye and tell them they were being handed over. James was sitting next to her. He leaned close and said quietly, "Some of them are going to vote to give them up." "I know," Sarah said. "What do we do if they do?" Sarah looked at the screens. "Make a lot of noise," she said. But President Dio spoke before the vote was called. She stood up from her position at the head of the council table and the screens in front of her, and she did not use any notes. She spoke for 11 minutes. Sarah later read the transcript 3 times. The argument Dio made was not complicated. She said that humanity had a history that contained many moments where one group of people had been handed over to another group because it seemed easier or safer or more rational than standing in the way. She said that every one of those moments was now remembered as a failure. Sometimes a small failure and sometimes a catastrophic one, but always a failure. She said that Earth's identity as a civilization was not built from its technology or its military capacity. It was built from what it chose to do when the choice was hard. She said that if they surrendered the Lathi to save themselves, they would survive, but something would be lost that could not be replaced, and they would spend the rest of their existence knowing exactly what they had chosen and what it cost. She said she was not willing to make that choice. She called the vote. It was not unanimous. 14 members of the council voted to surrender the refugees. Sarah noted their names. She did not plan to do anything with the list. She just noted them. The rest voted to stand. President Dio authorized military preparations immediately. Admiral Chan Wei left the room at a near run, which was the fastest Sarah had ever seen him move. Emergency production orders went out to every shipyard and manufacturing facility in the orbital network. Defense platforms were brought online. The satellite weapon systems were pulled out of their testing modes and configured for active combat operation. Reserve pilots were recalled. Every military unit in every branch of every nation began its specific piece of what the General Staff was already calling Operation Standing Ground. In the facility in Billings, Ze heard the vote result through James. She stood very still when he finished translating. Then she turned to the other Leothi and spoke to them in her own language fast and clearly. Sarah watched the group as they listened. Some of them looked shocked, some looked afraid. A few of the older ones looked like they were trying very hard not to show that they were crying. Then Ze came back to Sarah and James. She spoke and James translated. She says the Vorki will not accept the refusal. She says they will come with much more than 3 ships. She says no planet has ever turned them away and survived. Sarah nodded. We know, Ze spoke again. She says, James said carefully, that the Lorathi have spent 12 years running from the Vori, and they know their ships and their tactics and their weak points better than anyone alive. She says, if you are going to fight, they want to help. Sarah looked at Ze. Tell her, yes. The next 48 hours were the most intense that anyone in the facility could remember. Lorathi engineers who had been resting and recovering suddenly had something to do, and the change in them was visible and immediate. They worked alongside human engineers in whatever way the language gap allowed, using the translation device and James as bridges, sketching diagrams on digital boards and pointing at screens and talking rapidly. The Vori ships had specific structural vulnerabilities in their engine housings that their shielding did not fully cover. The Vorki communication frequencies could be disrupted in a way that temporarily blinded their targeting systems. The Vori commanders were trained to expect organized military resistance and were much less prepared for irregular or unexpected tactics. None of this was enough on its own, but it was more than nothing. And in the situation they were in, more than nothing was the difference between a plan and no plan at all. On the 58th hour after the message arrived, with 14 hours left on the Vorki deadline, Admiral Chen Wei sent the response. Earth's response was broadcast on the same frequencies as the Vori message. It was also short. It said, the people you are seeking are under the protection of Earth and the human species. They will not be surrendered. If you approach this planet with hostile intent, we will defend it and them with everything we have. We do not surrender the innocent. And try. The response was signed by President Dio, co-signed by the entire United Earth Council, except the 14 who had voted the other way, translated into every Vorki language frequency their ships were broadcasting on. On the Vorki flagship, somewhere between the orbits of Saturn and Jupiter, Grand Commander Thess read a response 3 times. He had received refusals before, a handful of them, from small civilizations with more pride and sense in the early days before the Vorki had established the kind of reputation that made refusals nearly impossible. Those civilizations were gone now, reduced to ruins and cautionary stories that served a useful purpose in galactic history. Thess was not angry. He did not feel anything he would call emotion in relation to this response. He simply adjusted his calculations, sent new signals back to the home fleet, and requested additional ships. What came back was not 3 ships worth of additional forces. What came back was 9 more. 12 Vorki warships began their final approach toward Earth, moving slowly, deliberately, the way a door closes when someone very large and very certain is pushing it. On Earth's orbital defense network, every screen lit up at once. Sarah stood in the main command room in Geneva and watched the dots on the display move. 12 of them, each one massive. Each one a weapon system pointed at the planet she was standing on. She looked at the display for a long time. Then she looked at the window. Outside it was a clear European morning, cold and bright, and the sky was the same blue it had always been. She thought about KL. She thought about Ze standing in the firelight with blood on her face and nowhere left to run. She straightened her shoulders. The countdown at the corner of the tactical display read 11 hours and 44 minutes. They had work to do. The first Vorki ship crossed the orbital defense threshold at 9 in the morning. No warning shot, no final demand, no ceremony. They came in formation. 12 ships spread in a wide crescent pattern, their hulls dark gray and enormous, moving with the slow confidence of things that had never been stopped. Grand Commander Vet's flagship sat at the center of the crescent, the largest of them, close to 400 meters from its blunt nose to its engine banks, trailing a faint purple energy discharge from its weapon systems warming up for engagement. On Earth's tactical screens, Admiral Cheney watched them come. He had 3 functional warships, and the rest of his plan had to work because the warships alone would not be enough. He had told himself this many times in the past 40 hours. Not enough had become his mantra. The pressure he pushed against every time he wanted to hesitate. Not enough was not the same as nothing. And nothing was not what he had. He opened the tactical channel. All stations. We are now at full combat status. Orbital platforms. You have weapons free on my mark. Satellite network confirmed. Targeting is live. Lunar defense array. Begin final warm-up sequence. All pilots, your briefings are final. No changes. He paused. This is what we trained for. Do your jobs. Chen out. The first shot came from the Vorhia fleet. It was a directed energy weapon, a beam of concentrated plasma the color of a bruise, aimed at the primary orbital weapons platform above the Pacific. The platform shielding held for 3 seconds, which was 2 more than the engineers had promised. And then it did not hold anymore. The platform erupted in a silent bloom of white light. Cheney did not flinch. He had already factored this into the plan. Mark, he said, the satellite network opened up. Humans had spent decades putting things in orbit. Communication satellites, weather satellites, scientific observation platforms, debris tracking systems, solar array systems. When the Planetary Defense Agency had begun its quiet work of converting some of that infrastructure into a weapons network, it had done so without advertising the fact, and the result was a web of firing positions that the Vorki scanners had not fully mapped. 237 separate systems opened fire, simultaneously, aimed at the approach vectors. The Lyrithi engineers had identified as the shield weak points on the flanks of the Vorki formation. Most of them did limited damage. Some of them hit. The Vorki formation broke slightly, ships adjusting, recalibrated covering each other. Vaching voice went out over their command channel, ordering a tightening of formation and a sweep of the satellite network. 11 Vorki ships began systematically destroying Earth's orbital assets, burning them out of the sky one by one. It was going to work. That was the thing about the satellite network. It did not need to win. It needed to occupy. While 11 ships dealt with the satellite network, 1 ship was now slightly separate from the formation. Chanwei's 3 warships hit it from 3 directions at the same moment. Earth's warships were not Vorai-class vessels. They were smaller, faster, built for a kind of combat that relied on mobility and multiple attack angles rather than raw firepower. The crews inside them were terrified and focused in equal measure, and they flew like they had nothing to lose, which in a practical sense they did not. The combined impact of 3 simultaneous strikes on a ship that had momentarily reduced its formation shielding was significant. The Vorki vessel did not explode, but it listed hard, its engines cut, and it drifted out of the engagement for repairs. The Vorki regrouped. They were not panicking. They were not afraid, but they had not expected this much resistance from a single annealing planet, and a minor recalibration was happening in the Vorai tactical computers. This was not the quick suppression of a primitive civilization. This was going to cost something. Thess found this mildly interesting in an academic sense. It did not change the outcome. He ordered a sustained bombardment of the lunar surface to eliminate the defense array. The lunar array had already fired. 6 nuclear warheads modified with Lorith engine technology attached by human engineers working for 36 sleepless hours straight hit the Vorki fleet at roughly 3 times the speed of Vorai targeting systems expected. 4 were intercepted, 2 were not. One hit the edge of a mid-size Vorki vessel and peeled a section of its hull open. One hit nothing but passed so close to the flagship that Vaching's entire command deck shook violently and the lights went briefly red. That's recalculated again. He ordered full bombardment of the planet's surface, targeting population centers. If the humans wanted to be stubborn, he would give them something to be stubborn about. The first strikes hit the coast of Western Australia and the Black Sea region. The energy impacts were not nuclear in the traditional sense, but the force of them created shock waves that leveled structures for kilometers in all directions. Fires started, communications in those zones went down. Emergency services scrambled. Sarah, watching the tactical feed from Geneva, felt her stomach drop. She turned to the secondary screen. Where are the Lathi volunteers? For Lathi had come forward the day before. Engineers and one former military technical officer from L'Esprit Conquest Defense Force, a quiet man named Iran, who had spent 12 years feeling useless. They had been placed with the crews of Earth's two repaired secondary ships, serving as tactical advisors, walking the crews through Vorki weakness patterns in real time using James' translation device on a live channel. Ern's ship is moving. Someone behind Sarah said on the screen. The secondary Earth ship designated Task Unit 3 was doing something unusual. Instead of engaging directly, it was moving along an approach vector that Aaron had suggested. A curved path that kept it below the horizontal firing plane of 3 Vorki ships at once. Using the orbital geometry, the way a small fish uses the shadow under a rock, the Vorki targeting computers tracked it, but kept losing it in the gravitational interference generated by their own ships clustered together. Task Unit 3 reached the position AON had marked. It fired one focused burst at an angle that no human tactician would have tried. Too oblique, too specific, aimed at nothing a human weapon specialist would have identified as a target. Iron had identified it. A junction between the primary shield emitter and the cooling system on the second largest Vorai ship, a point that was shielded on every side except for one narrow geometric angle that only became available at a specific orbital position. The burst found it. The second largest Vorai ship lost shields entirely for 40 seconds. Jenny had been waiting. Every remaining weapon on the satellite network that had not been destroyed. Both remaining functional warships and the 2 surviving lunar platform guns all fired at the same ship in the same 40 seconds. The ship broke apart. It broke apart slowly. The way large things come apart with pieces separating and tumbling and secondary explosions moving through it in sequence. And then it was done and the debris field was moving outward and there were 11 Vorki ships left. The Vorki fleet went briefly silent on their command channels. This had not happened in the Vorki's long military history in hundreds of campaigns against dozens of species. This specific thing, a Vorai warship destroyed in combat by a civilization they were suppressing, had never happened. Not once. Thess sat in his command chair and looked at the tactical display. He acknowledged the loss with one note in the battle log. Then he ordered a full convergence on Earth. All ships, all weapons, end this immediately. Burn whatever you need to burn. Sarah saw the formation change on her screen. All 11 ships tightening and coming fast. Admiral, she said into her channel. Jenny's voice came back very calm. I see it. We need a contingency. I know it has to be now. I know, Captain. A short pause. Gets ya. Sarah was already moving. The contingency plan had been built in the last 20 hours. Quietly between Chen Wei and Zhe and Aaron and James drawn on a digital board in the facility's conference room at 2:00 in the morning while the rest of the base slept. It was not a straightforward plan. It relied on things that human military doctrine had no existing category for. It relied on the fact that the Lorathi knew exactly how Vorki command structures worked, exactly how their flagship communicated with the rest of the fleet and exactly what happened to a Vorki formation. When the flagship lost its ability to give orders, it relied on one other thing. Sarah ran behind her. She could hear the building shaking faintly as another energy impact struck somewhere on the planet's surface. Emergency lights were flickering. Somewhere in the facility, children were crying. She ran faster. She pushed through the door into the corridor where the Larathi were housed. Zia was already standing. She had heard the sounds. She had felt the shaking. She was wearing the translation device on her wrist, and her silver eyes were clear and steady and frightened and determined all at the same moment. The way eyes look when a person has run out of safe places and the only direction left is forward. Sarah looked at her. "It's time," Sarah said. Zia nodded. She turned back to the other Larathi and spoke quickly and cleanly and with a certainty that made every person in that room, human and Larathi alike, stand up straighter. Sarah could not understand the words, but she could feel the shape of them, the bone of them, the way good words feel when they are being said by someone who means them. Completely. Zia turned back. She and Sarah walked out of the corridor together, side by side, moving toward the communication center where the final phase of the plan was waiting. While 11 Vorki warships closed on Earth from above, and the sky outside the windows burned with the reflected light of a battle that humanity had refused to run from, the trap was ready. All they needed to do now was spring it. The plan depended on a lie, not a complicated lie, a focused one used like a tool aimed at a very specific weakness in the Vorki command structure that Zia and Aaron had spent years quietly cataloging while running for their lives through the dark between the stars. The Vorki fleet operated on a strict command hierarchy. Every order came from the flagship. Every tactical decision filtered down through Grand Commander Vaching Channel. The individual ship commanders were capable fighters, but they were trained to execute, not to think independently. If the flagship's communication array went down, even briefly, the fleet would pause. They would wait for orders. Doctrine required it. In Vorki history, a fleet that acted without central command had twice caused catastrophic friendly fire incidents, and the Empire had responded by making independent action essentially impossible at the tactical level. It was a strength when the command structure was intact. It was a vulnerability when it was not. The lie worked like this. Zia, speaking on a frequency she knew the Vorki flagship monitored, broadcast a short message in perfect Vorki military dialect using codes that Aaron had memorized from his time studying captured Vorai communication records on Lyrith. The message identified itself as coming from the Vorki ship that had been destroyed, which was impossible. But Vorki communication encoding did not include a self-verify. The message said that an anomalous weapon signature had been detected moving toward the flagship on a deep approach vector and that the flagship should immediately drop its forward shield layer and redirect power to its rear defensive array. It was a nonsense order, a tactical contradiction. Any Vorki commander with independent judgment would have questioned it. VETS tactical computer, operating on strict protocol, flagged it as a legitimate priority command from a fleet asset, requested a two-con hold, and redirected the shield power. The flagship's forward shield layer drop. Ask Unit 3 and Chen Wei's to surviving warships had been moving for 4 minutes along the approach angle Iran had specified. The same geometric thinking that had destroyed the second warship. Using the gravitational interference of the other Vorki ships as cover, when the flagship's shield dropped, they were already at the firing position. They fired everything, every weapon on all 3 vessels simultaneously at the specific structural points Aaron had drawn on the board at 2 in the morning. The places where the flagship's internal systems converged, where the engine core met the command architecture, where a focused strike would not just damage the ship, but collapse its entire power distribution network from the inside out. The flagship did not explode in one single dramatic moment. It died in pieces. Each system failing in sequence, the power running out of it like water out of a broken vessel. The massive dark shape of it went dark first, then began to fracture. Huge panels of hull separating and spinning away. The interior fires visible through the gaps, and then the engine core gave way and the light of it was very bright and very brief, and then it was over. Brand Commander thus died in his command chair, looking at a tactical display that had stopped making sense 3 seconds before the end. On the tactical screens in Geneva, Sarah watched the flagship signal disappear. The room went completely silent. Then Chenna's voice came over the channel, very even, very controlled. The voice of a man who had prepared himself not to show too much. Flagship is down. Confirm. 3 different stations confirmed it at the same time. The 10 remaining Vorai ships went silent. Their weapons stopped firing. Their formation, which had been tightening toward Earth with brutal momentum, stalled. The ships were still moving, still functional, but the communications between them dropped to nothing as every crew waited for orders that were not coming. 40 seconds passed, then 60. Then the nearest Vorai ship fired its lateral thrusters, changing its heading, not toward Earth, away from it. The ship next to it did the same. Then the next, not a coordinated retreat because there was no command coordination anymore. Just 10 separate groups of Vorki soldiers making the same individual calculation in the absence of orders. Looking at a debris field where their flagship had been, looking at their own damage reports and deciding that this engagement was not what it had been planned to be. Within 4 minutes, all 10 ships had altered course. Within 12 minutes, they had passed back through the orbital threshold. Within 30 minutes, they were gone from the inner solar system entirely, drives burning hard for the outer edge of the system, where the jump point would take them back to Vorki space. Genie sat in his chair in the command room for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "All stations, stand down from combat alert. Initiate damage assessment and emergency protocols. Begin rescue operations in impact zones." He paused once more. "We held in the facility in Billings," Sa heard it through James' translation. She sat down on the floor where she was standing, not because her legs gave out. Deliberately, carefully, sitting down because her body needed to be still for a moment. She put her hands flat on the floor and felt the solid earth of a planet that was not hers under her palms, and she breathed. Hale came and sat beside her and leaned against her arm. And Sa put one long blue hand on the boy's head and neither of them spoke. The damage Earth had taken was real and it was serious. The energy strikes on Western Australia and the Black Sea coast had killed hundreds of people and injured thousands more. Infrastructure was damaged in 4 different regions. The orbital network had taken devastating losses. Nearly 60% of Earth's satellite infrastructure was gone or inoperable. 3 Earth pilots had died in the battle. Their ships hit and destroyed before the final phase. Their names were released late that evening and read aloud in every language broadcast by every station that was still operational. Sarah stood in the courtyard of the Geneva facility. When the names were read, she stood at attention. She stayed that way until the last name was spoken. The recovery operations ran for weeks. It would take years to fully rebuild. The economists said this. The engineers said this. The people living near the impact zones said things that were more direct and more personal and more important than any economist's assessment. Sarah heard them, and she did not argue. The cost was real. It would have been dishonest to pretend otherwise. But the other thing was also real. The galaxy had been watching. The Vorki Empire operated in a region of space that contained hundreds of inhabited worlds, dozens of species, networks of civilizations that had long since stopped believing that resistance was possible. The Vori's reputation was built on a simple premise. There was no point in fighting. The mathematics never worked. No single planet could win. No unified civilization could hold. The correct choice was always to negotiate terms of surrender and try to make them as manageable as possible. Earth had not done the correct thing. Earth had done the other thing. The thing that the Vorki's entire strategic doctrine depended on never happening. And they had won. Every species in that region of space received the recording. Some received it through underground communication networks that operated in secret. Some received it through the open channels that the Vorai monitored but could not completely control. The recording showed the battle, showed the flagship falling, showed the Vorai fleet retreating from a single planet that had refused to surrender the people it had promised to protect. It was a small recording, 47 minutes long. It changed nothing immediately. It did not dissolve the Vorki Empire. It did not free the worlds already under their control. But something moved, something that had not moved in a long time, in a great many places. Sarah was in the facility 2 weeks after the battle when the first message came in from outside the solar system. It was brief and came on a frequency she did not recognize. Translated by James with the help of Z and the translation device. It's simply, "We saw what you did. We did not know it was possible. We are trying to remember that it is." It was not signed. Sarah understood why. More messages followed in the weeks after that. Some signed, some not. Some long, some just a few words. They came from species she had never heard of, from worlds she could not find on any human star chart. They were all saying in different ways the same thing. "You stood, we saw, we are thinking." The formal ceremony was held on a Tuesday, 2 months after the battle. It was not elaborate. President Dio had specifically asked for it to be simple. There was a room and people in it and the right words spoken clearly. The United Earth Council formally granted the Larathi full planetary asylum, permanent residence rights, and the beginning of a full diplomatic partnership. Land was offered in 3 different regions of the world, and the Leroy, who had been consulting quietly among themselves for weeks, chose a broad valley in New Zealand, where the light was similar in quality to what they remembered from Lirith. Or so Zara said when James asked her about the choice. She said it gently without grief, just as a fact. The way people sometimes carry loss after a long time. Not as a wound anymore, but as a truth they have learned to live inside. At the ceremony, Zah and Sarah stood next to each other. Zah gave a short speech in Larathi that James translated phrase by phrase. She said that her people had not chosen to come to Earth. They had fallen here by accident, broken and frightened and hunted. She said they had expected to be turned away or handed over because that was what their history had taught them to expect. She said that what Earth had done instead was something she did not have a word for in her language, and she had been thinking about it for 2 months and she still did not have a word for it, and she thought that was right because some things should not be made small enough to fit in a word. The room was quiet when James finished translating. Then Sarah spoke. She said that what Zah called something she could not name. Humans called a lot of different things. Justice, decency, solidarity. She said that for her personally, it had not been a complicated decision because a child had held her hand in the dark and that had been enough. She said that she hoped it was always enough. She said she thought it should be. After the ceremony, Sarah found Cale in the courtyard outside. He was standing with his face tipped up toward the sky, the way he had been doing more and more in the weeks since the battle, now with curiosity rather than fear. The New Zealand afternoon was warm and the sky was the clear, clean blue it gets when the air is cold and fresh. Sarah stood next to him and looked up. She thought about the messages still coming in from across the galaxy. She thought about Zah's valley and the light that reminded the Leothi of home. She thought about Aaron, who had spent 12 years feeling useless and had in the end been more useful than almost anyone. She thought about the 3 pilots whose names had been read in the evening after the battle, and she thought about them with the full weight of what they had given, which she would not reduce by looking away from it. Hale looked at her. He said something and Sarah looked at James, who had followed them out. James smiled. He says the sky here is nice. He says he thinks he likes it. Sarah looked up at the sky, that he's welcome to it. Tell him it's his now too. James translated. Hale looked up at the sky again for a long moment. Then he nodded, the slow, deliberate nod that meant the same thing in Larathi as it meant in every human language Sarah had ever encountered. Yes, good. I understand. The afternoon light was long and golden over the Geneva courtyard and somewhere spaced between the stars. Something was changing slowly, uncertainly. The way change always moves at first, not like a wave, but like a crack in ice, spreading out from the place where something had been heavy enough and steady enough to break the surface. Earth had been that thing. Not because it was the strongest, not because it had the most ships or the most weapons or the most power, but because 47 people had fallen out of the sky with nowhere to go, and humanity had looked at them and made a choice. That choice was in the recording now. In the messages, in the cracks spreading across the ice, in Kale's eyes watching the sky without fear. It would not save everyone. Not yet, not quickly, but it was a beginning. And beginnings were how everything that mattered had always started. With one person deciding that the right thing was worth doing, even when the cost was real, even when the risk was enormous, even when the easiest and safest and most reasonable thing was to look away, humanity had not looked away. The stars remembered, and somewhere in the dark between them, the people who had been silent for a very long time were beginning very quietly to